Do you brace yourself every time your phone buzzes with a message from the lab? Do you replay old numbers in your head on the drive to your own appointment, like you're rehearsing a verdict before anyone's read it to you? I did exactly that for 11 years, filing every single result into a plain manila folder like it was evidence being built against me. 4 facts finally took that folder out of my hands. I'm going to give you all 4. I'm 83. These days I still get my number checked every year, right on schedule. But I open the folder now the way I'd open a phone bill, mildly curious, not bracing for a verdict. 2 months ago, I sat in that same waiting room, results due any minute, and I read a paperback the whole time instead of watching the door. I'm not telling you that to sound wise about it. I'm telling you because for over a decade I couldn't have sat still in that chair to save my life. The folder started small. 1 page, 1 number, tucked in a drawer. By year 3, it had a tab. By year 6, my wife had started calling it the folder in a tone I didn't like it was a filing cabinet for bad news I was keeping just in case I needed to build a case for something. I never said the word cancer out loud in our house. I didn't have to. Everyone in that car on the drive home from the lab knew what the silence meant. That drive became its own ritual. My wife would put both hands on the wheel and not turn on the radio because she'd learned that any noise at all felt like an intrusion on whatever math I was doing in my head. I'd stare at the passing mile markers and run the numbers from memory, 4.1, then 4.6, and 5.3, like a man reciting a sentence being read to him 1 clause at a time. Neither of us said a word until we were most of the way home, and even then it was usually just her asking if I wanted the radio on now, which was our way of saying the verdict reading was over for another year. I want to be fair to the man who handed me those numbers. He wasn't hiding anything from me out of some scheme. He had a waiting room full of patients and about 8 minutes per appointment, and a full explanation of prostate physiology has never once fit into 8 minutes, no matter how much either of us wished it could. He'd say the number was up a bit, noted in the chart, and moved to my blood pressure before I'd even finished absorbing what up a bit was supposed to mean for the rest of my year. So I started reading on my own, the way a man does when nobody else is going to hand him the whole picture. And what I found broke down into 4 plain facts, the kind that would have taken maybe 15 minutes to explain if anyone had ever had 15 minutes to spare. Fact 1 is the one that should be taught before a man ever takes the test at all. This number was never a cancer number. It's a prostate number. It rises whenever prostate tissue does more work or grows more tissue, through infection, through recent activity, through simple friction, and most commonly of all, through the gland getting larger the way nearly every organ shifts with age. A number can climb for a dozen benign reasons before cancer is ever a serious candidate on the list. I'd spent a decade treating a prostate gauge like a courtroom summons. Fact 2 explains why it almost never stops climbing once a man passes 60. The prostate wraps around a tube most men would rather not think about, and with age, that gland typically keeps growing, a process with its own name, benign prostatic enlargement, that has nothing to do with malignancy. Research tracking large groups of aging men has found that a substantial share of men in their 60s and an even larger share in their 70s and beyond carry some degree of this benign enlargement. It is closer to gray hair than to a diagnosis. Almost every man who lives long enough eventually meets it. My daughter is a nurse, and she was the one who finally said the sentence that should have come from somewhere official years earlier. She told me the reason nobody explains this in a rushed appointment isn't that it's complicated. It's that it's ordinary, and ordinary things don't get much airtime in a system built around 8-minute slots and the next patient in the hallway. She said the test itself was never designed to read a man's mind about which of a dozen benign causes was responsible for a given rise. It was designed to flag something worth a closer look, nothing more and nothing less, and the whole apparatus of dread around it had grown up in the space where a real explanation should have been. She also told me something that reframed the entire folder for me on its own. An enlarged prostate is not cancer, and having one does not raise a man's risk of developing it. Those are 2 separate tracks entirely, running side by side in the same gland. And for 11 years I had let one bleed into the other simply because nobody had ever drawn the line between them out loud, in plain language, in a room where I could actually ask a follow-up question. For years, one number ran my life, the PSA. It would tick up a point, and I'd lie awake the whole night, certain it meant the worst, picturing the biopsy, the knife, the end of everything. Then someone finally told me the truth no doctor had. That number doesn't measure cancer. It measures your prostate. And as we age, it climbs mostly because the gland is simply enlarging, benign, swollen, and uncomfortable, not the worst. The number was scaring me half to death over something ordinary. And the prescriptions they push to shrink it? They can flatten your drive completely, soften everything, quietly take the man right out of you. I wasn't willing to trade that away. There's a gentle way to support that gland, keep it comfortable, a healthy size, without surrendering any of that. Keep getting checked every year, of course. At 83, that number doesn't own me anymore. I finally have peace. Let me show you what gave it to me in this video. And if you want the simple support I personally use, there's a free presentation linked in the description below. Fact 3 is the one nobody in that 8-minute appointment ever got around to, and it's the one that finally let me put the folder down. An old friend of mine, a retired urologist I've known since our sons played ball together, sat with me one Sunday afternoon and walked through it slowly, the way nobody in a rushed clinic ever could. He said that benign growth doesn't sit there quietly. It comes with a low simmer of inflammation, and that inflammation is a meaningful piece of why so many older men feel pressure, urgency, and general discomfort that has nothing to do with the number itself. He told me research has pointed to a particular plant compound, the kind found concentrated in green tea, that carries real anti-inflammatory activity in that tissue specifically. Study groups given standardized green tea polyphenols showed measurable improvement in comfort-related markers tied to that low-grade inflammation compared with men who weren't. He was careful, and I'll be just as careful here. This is about comfort and inflammation in the gland, never about the number on a lab report, and never, under any circumstance, about cancer. What struck me most was the second half of what he explained, because it answered a question I'd never even known how to ask. He said certain compounds in green tea, the same polyphenols, appear to act locally inside prostate tissue itself, gently limiting how much testosterone converts into a more potent hormone right there in the gland, without touching testosterone levels anywhere else in the body. That distinction mattered enormously to me, because the medications my doctor had once mentioned in passing, the ones that work on that same hormone pathway system-wide, come with a well-documented list of side effects tied to a man's drive and function that no one my age takes lightly. A compound working quietly and locally, right where the discomfort actually lives, without dragging the rest of the body's hormones along for the ride, felt like an entirely different proposition. I started drinking 2 to 3 cups a day, unsweetened, spread through the morning and early afternoon so it wouldn't interfere with sleep. I didn't expect a miracle, and I didn't get one. What I got, gradually, over roughly 6 weeks, was a body that felt less like it was constantly clearing its throat about something. My friend was equally clear that no single cup of tea carries a man's comfort on its own, so I built it into a small system rather than treating it as a magic trick. Alongside the tea, I added a handful of pumpkin seeds most afternoons, a food with its own separately documented association with urinary comfort in aging men. I cut back sharply on the fried food and the extra salt I'd been eating without thinking about it, since that kind of eating adds to the same general inflammatory load that was already working against me. And I started a short walk most mornings, nothing dramatic, because regular movement has its own independent link to milder urinary symptoms as men get older. 4 small, unglamorous habits, working as one system rather than 4 separate hopes. None of these 4 habits happened overnight, and I want to be honest about that instead of making it sound tidier than it was. The tea was easy. I've always liked the ritual of a hot cup in the morning, so that one felt less like a change and more like a small upgrade to something I already did. The fried food was harder. I'd been eating some version of a fish fry or a plate of hash browns most weekends for decades, and giving that up felt less like a health decision and more like giving up a piece of my own routine. My wife noticed before I did that I'd started reaching for it less, and she never once said a word about it, just quietly stopped buying the oil we used to go through so fast. The walk was the habit I nearly abandoned twice. The first 2 weeks, my knees complained loudly enough that I told myself the whole thing wasn't worth the trouble. What kept me going was something small and almost embarrassing. I started walking the same stretch of road every morning, past the same 3 houses, and the neighbors started waving in a way that made the walk feel less like a chore and more like a piece of my day I would have missed if I'd skipped it. By the 6th week, I wasn't thinking about my knees at all, and I wasn't thinking about my prostate either. I was just walking, the way I used to before any of this started. Fact 4 is the quietest of the bunch, and it's the one that finally let me close the folder for good instead of just tolerating it. Understanding what the number measures and supporting comfort in the gland itself does not mean a man stops watching. It means he watches without dread. The annual test still matters. The conversation with his doctor still matters. What changes is what's sitting in his chest on the drive home. Last fall, my wife and I drove 4 hours to see our grandson play in a tournament, a trip I would have quietly dreaded a few years back, simply because it meant a full day away from anywhere familiar, with my own body somewhere in the back of my mind the whole drive. This time, I don't think I thought about my prostate once, not on the drive up, not during the games, not on the drive home either. I think often about a man named Burton, 71, who wrote to me after finding an earlier version of this explanation online. He told me he'd been keeping his own version of my folder for 9 years. Not a manila one, his was a spreadsheet, but the instinct behind it was identical to mine. Every result logged, every appointment dreaded, every drive home spent doing the same silent arithmetic I used to do. He said his doctor had used the exact words, "Let's just keep monitoring it," so many times across so many years that the phrase had started to feel like a locked door rather than a plan. Burton told me the 4 facts were the first explanation that actually held together for him. He said he'd gone back and reread his own spreadsheet after learning them, and what used to look like a slow, ominous climb now looked, in his words, like a chart of a body doing exactly what an aging body does. He started the same kind of system I had, the tea, the seeds, cutting the fried food, the morning walk, and he still keeps his annual appointment without fail. He told me the appointment itself feels shorter now, not because his doctor talks less, but because he isn't spending half of it silently rehearsing his own fear. What stuck with me most about Burton's letter was a small detail near the end. He said his wife had started sitting in the waiting room with a magazine instead of standing by the reception desk watching the clock, because she'd noticed he wasn't glancing at the door every 90 seconds anymore. She hadn't said anything to him about it directly. She'd just quietly changed her own habit to match his, the way people do when they've been carrying someone else's dread right alongside them for years without ever naming it. Burton told me that was the moment he realized the folder, or in his case the spreadsheet, had never really belonged to him alone. It had been sitting on both of them the whole time. I think about that detail often, because it was true in my own house too. My wife never once complained about the folder or the silent drives home, not in 11 years. But I noticed, the same year I finally understood these 4 facts, that she'd started turning the radio on again without waiting for my signal that the appointment was behind us. Small as it sounds, that was its own kind of proof that something in our house had actually changed, not just something in my head. If you're on medication for your prostate, your blood pressure, or your heart, please hear this clearly. Nothing here replaces your treatment or your screening schedule, and you should never stop or adjust any medication without your doctor's direct guidance. Keep getting your number checked every single year, without exception, exactly as your doctor has you scheduled, regardless of how much calmer you start to feel about the number itself. Here's what I settled on: a few drops a day. And let me tell you why it works. One compound calms one signal, but a swollen prostate answers when several are calmed at once. The growth signal, the inflammation, the pressure inside it. So what I use concentrates them, working as one, the way the research actually uses them, not a single ingredient pretending to be enough. A gland that stays comfortable and a healthy size, fewer trips, and the quiet of no longer fearing that number. It leaves the man fully intact, none of that flattening the prescriptions can do. It's linked right under this video, go look for yourself. It won't replace your doctor or your yearly check. It supports the biology right alongside them. I'm 83, and that number doesn't own me anymore. What I want you to walk away with is this. 4 facts were all it ever took to take that folder out of my hands. The number measures the gland, not a verdict. The gland tends to grow with age in nearly every man who lives long enough. Comfort in that gland is something you can actually support day to day without touching the number or the screening that protects you. And watching without dread is not the same thing as not watching at all. It's simply watching like a man who finally understands what he's looking at. I think about the man who used to sit in that car reciting numbers like a sentence being handed down to him, saying nothing the whole drive home because there was nothing he knew how to say. And I think about the man I am now, folder still in the drawer, still opened every year, read now the way you'd read a phone bill instead of a verdict. If you've ever kept your own version of that folder, a drawer, a spreadsheet, a slip of paper you never told anyone about, tell me about it in the comments. I'd like to know I'm not the only one who did. And if an explanation like this one, plain and specific instead of rushed and vague, is useful to you, go ahead and subscribe. There's more of this every week, and I read every comment myself, folders and spreadsheets very much included.